I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We're in the book of Daniel. We're going to be doing an introduction tonight. So we're going to be jumping around the book, and we're going to be jumping around a couple other places as well. And so it's not going to be verse by verse tonight. But Daniel is in a section of what we call the major prophets. Why do we call this book and a few other books the major prophets? Are they more important?
Just because they're big books?
They're bigger books. Of the minor prophets, I think Zechariah is the longest. It will rival Daniel in chapters. However, in content, the book of Daniel has a lot more. It rivals Zechariah as to which one's tougher, but Daniel is usually considered tougher. And the authorship is ascribed to Daniel. Notice in Daniel chapter 9, we're going to get Naomi to get Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. We'll get Henry to get Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. Daniel chapter 9, verse 1.
In the first year of Darius, the son of Azarias, by the sons of Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans.
Get verse 2 as well.
In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the numbers of years according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, and was passed before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years.
Okay, we're not getting into discussing what the 70 years are. We'll do that when we get to chapter 9. All I want to note here is it's I, Daniel. And so Daniel, the writer here is saying that he is Daniel. And so that should give us a clue who we're talking about. The first part of the book really deals with the biography of Daniel and what happens. It's centered around Daniel with the exception of really one story talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with the idol that they were told to bow down to. The rest of the book surrounds Daniel, and it focuses on Daniel and how Daniel dealt with the different kings. Daniel chapter 10 and verse 1.
In the 30th year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a messenger was revealed to Daniel. Daniel, whose name was called
Belteshazzar.
The messenger was true, but the appointed time was none, and he understood the message. The message and had understanding of religion.
Get verse 2 as well for that one as well.
In those days, I, Daniel, was 93 weeks.
All right. So again, we have the pronoun. I don't know why my dad, who wrote the book, decided not to put either of those two verses in, but he did. And so in those days, I, Daniel. And so we get again that we don't often get that in a lot of books where it's the author speaking in the first person or in the third person about themselves and really narrating the prophecy. Usually it's thus says the Lord. And sometimes we might, in the prophets, we usually get Isaiah or Habakkuk or Hosea or like as far as the second part at the beginning of the book. But when it comes to their prophecies, we don't get this sort of thing. But the book is purported to be written by Daniel, and we can trust that it is. However, Daniel is set in a time period. We have to know the time period in order especially to understand the first few chapters of Daniel. And so we have what happened during the reign of Rehoboam. What happened to Israel? That was the son of Solomon.
Separated?
All right, so we have two kingdoms. We have the northern nation of Israel and the southern nation of Judah. Southern nation of Judah was ruled by kings from the line of David, and we had a mixture of good and bad kings. Whereas northern nation of Israel started with the reign of Jeroboam, and these were not Davidic kings. They didn't come from the line of David, but all of those kings were evil. Let's find out what happened to that northern nation of Israel. In 2 Kings chapter 17, we'll go over here. 2 Kings 17. We'll read 2 verses each. We'll get verse 1. And then, so Bill can get verses 1 and 6, and then we'll do 2 verses each after that. 1 and 6, and then 2 verses after that. Go Tammy, back to Naomi, Henry, and Dion back.
In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria, and placed them in Halah, and by the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes.
For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And they feared other gods, and had walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel which they had made.
And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. They built for themselves high places in all their towns and watchtowers fortified cities. They set up for themselves pillars and Asherah on every high hill and under every green tree.
There they burned incense on all the high places, like the nations whom the God has carried away before them. And they did wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. For they served the idols of which the Lord had said to them, "You shall not do these things."
Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, "Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes, in according with all the law that I commanded your fathers, that I said to you by my servants the prophets." But they would not listen, but were stubborn, as their fathers had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God.
Come up to Bill, verse 15. 15 and 16.
And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he had testified against them. They followed idols, became idolaters, and went after the nations who were all around them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molten image and 2 calves, made a wooden image, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven, and served Baal.
And they caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire, practiced witchcraft and soothsaying, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone.
All right. Now, it's very interesting. It just times so well with what we talked about on Sunday. It was in the 12th year of Ahaz. We talked about Ahaz on Sunday. Remember the prophet Isaiah came to Ahaz, and we talked about the Emmanuel prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7. When Dion read earlier that he brought prophets to Israel, that would have been during the days of Isaiah. Isaiah came to Judah, but that doesn't mean Israel had no prophets. Elijah prophesied to Israel. Ahab was a northern king, not a southern king. And so even Elisha, when he was involved there, was sort of a bit of both. And so Israel had prophets sent from God, but they didn't worship God. They worshipped idols. And so the last king of Israel was Hoshea. It was not the king that Ahaz feared, but in that Emmanuel prophecy, God told Ahaz, don't be afraid of Israel, because I'm going to bring them down. This is the fulfillment of that prophecy in Isaiah 7 about God bringing down Israel. Tiglath-Pileser is the Assyrian king that Ahaz wanted to make a league with. Well, this is the Assyrian king coming and taking Israel into captivity. That happened about a century before the period of Daniel. So Israel's been gone for a century. By the time Israel was, or by the time we're talking about the time period of Daniel, the people, the nation of Israel had been replaced by what in the New Testament would become the Samaritans. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, brought in peoples to fill that land, as God had prophesied as well in Isaiah 7. And so the Samaritans, what we would call the Samaritans in the New Testament, would have already been there. Judah, though, sort of limped on for 100 years. Ahaz was an evil king. His son Hezekiah was a good king. And then we got down to Manasseh, and we got down to Ammon, and then we got down to Josiah. And Manasseh was a wicked king, more wicked than the most wicked king in Judah up to that point. And we had Ammon. He didn't reign that long. And then we come to the time of Josiah, the last good king of Israel. And so let's skip ahead to chapter 23 in 2 Kings. We're not going to read a lot, but we'll get Naomi to get 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 29 and 30.
In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. And his servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo, and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb.
The rest of it did.
Sorry. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, and appointed him and made him king of God's place.
Okay, I was wondering where Jehoahaz was, because it is sort of important that we have Jehoahaz there as well. What we have here is just the second Kings reference to how Josiah died. The battle that Josiah died in is actually a battle that would be recorded in history. As far as Pharaoh Necho and the king of Assyria, they battled in Carchemish, but Josiah was killed in Megiddo fighting Pharaoh Necho, who was wanting to go up. Actually, it was the Babylonians as well. He was wanting to go up, had to pass through Judah in order to get to Carchemish, and Josiah went out to face him, and he died. And so what we have here is the record of the last good king of Judah. After Josiah, this is about 605, 606 BC. After Josiah, we just had a set of kings that come very quickly, because Judah was going to be controlled not by itself, but by King Nebuchadnezzar. Let's continue on in 2 Kings 23. We'll get Henry to get 31 to 33.
Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king. He reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, and the daughters of Jeremiah of Nephthah. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father had done. Now Herod Necho put him in prison at Riblah in the land of Moab, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he imposed on the land of a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Okay, so we have here
Jehoahaz reigning, he was very young. How long did he reign?
23 years.
Now, he was 23 years old when he began to reign. How long did he reign?
3 months.
That's not very long. Barely long enough to get used to being in the palace. How come he reigns for so short?
Pharaoh Necho captured.
Yeah, Pharaoh Necho captured him, and who did he put in place? Verse 34.
Eliakim, son of Josiah.
Yeah, so we had another son of Josiah. We know Eliakim by a different name. We know him as Jehoiakim, and he was placed in. So in other words, now we have a second king of Judah, a second son of Josiah reigning in Judah. Let's get his reign. Verses 34 through 37. We'll get Dion to get 34 and 35. Bill 36 and 37.
And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, king, son of Josiah, king in the place of Josiah his father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt and died there. And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give the money according to the command of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and gold of the people of the land from everyone according to his assessment to give to Pharaoh Necho.
Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebidah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done.
Okay, so we've got Jehoiakim. We had the 23-year-old who reigned for 3 months. How old was Jehoiakim when he started reigning?
23? No.
25.
Oh, 25.
I find it interesting. Jehoiakim was older, and yet he wasn't the first to reign. Jehoahaz was the younger one. We know from the kings of Judah, it didn't always fall to the oldest one. Solomon wasn't the oldest son of David. He wasn't even the oldest living son of David. Jehoahaz was the one who took the throne. He was 23, reigned for 3 months. Jehoiakim was placed in power by Pharaoh Necho. And when you're placed in power by another country, what does that show about your power?
Not really your power.
No. And so, what had to happen? According to verse 35, what did Jehoiakim do with Pharaoh Necho? What did he have to give him?
Seems to pay the tribute money.
Yeah. Pharaoh Necho basically said, "You owe me money now. You're a vassal state of me. I get tax money." It's a lot like the Romans in the time of Jesus. The Romans were the ruling power. Jews had to pay taxes to the Romans. Well, the Egyptians here exacted a tax. How long did Jehoiakim reign for? He reigned for 11 years. So he was a little bit more successful. Was he a good king or bad king? Bad king. We'll study a little bit more about him, Lord willing, in August when we talk about Jehoiakim's penknife in the book of Jeremiah. The prophet Jeremiah is the major prophet during these last few years in Judah. And so we have Jehoiakim here. He's placed into power. But remember I had said earlier, Pharaoh Necho, even though he's powerful, he's not the big power. Babylonians are growing in power. And so let's move ahead to chapter 24. We'll get Tammy to get verse 7.
And the king of Egypt did not come out of his land anymore, for the king of Babylon had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates.
Okay, so we have here the king of Egypt lost at Carchemish around 605 BC is when Pharaoh Necho lost. I think that's the Battle of Carchemish. Depends on when you date it. And so Nebuchadnezzar is now the reigning power here. And so what we have here is a king who was installed by Pharaoh Necho, but now Nebuchadnezzar is in charge. Jehoiakim, in the first few years, remember he reigned 11 years. And so in the first few years, got along with Nebuchadnezzar, at least as well as you can. But eventually, there was a problem. And so Jehoiakim died, and his son, I think there's a typo in the book, for as far as who was taken off into Babylon. Let's go to 2 Chronicles 36. We'll get this. 2 Chronicles 36, verses 5 to 8. I guess it's not. So we'll get Naomi to get 2 Chronicles 36, 5 to 8. Yes.
Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Against him stood up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in chains to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried part of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon, and put them in his palace in Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations that he did and what was found against him, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place.
All right, so we got Jehoiakim here. He is carried off into Babylon. He got along for a little bit, but eventually Nebuchadnezzar came in and took him away. His son, Jehoiachin, reigned in his stead. And so when Jehoiakim was taken off into captivity, this is the first captivity, the first wave of captivity for the nation of Judah. This is the captivity that Daniel and his friends were taken off in. Judah would last as a nation for another 20 years. Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he became king. He reigned 3 months and 10 days. In Jerusalem he did evil in the sight of the Lord. At the turn of the year, King Nebuchadnezzar summoned him and took him to Babylon with the costly articles from the house of the Lord, and made Zedekiah, Jehoiakim's brother, king of Judah in Jerusalem. Zedekiah will be the last king of Judah. But it's during Jehoiakim's reign, that first wave of captivity, that Daniel was taken into captivity. So let's go back to the book of Daniel and get the verse 7 verses as part of our introduction. It will help us a little bit. So let's get verses 1 to 7. We'll start with Henry. We'll do 2 verses each.
In the 30 years of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his land with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought this article into the charter house of his God.
And the king instructed
John first.
And the king commanded Ashkenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and the nobility, you without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and comprehension teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans.
And the king appointed for them the daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego.
All right. So remember, Jehoiakim reigned 11 years. It was in the 3rd year of this reign that Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Nebuchadnezzar besieged it. It wasn't an immediate victory for Nebuchadnezzar. The Jews did put up a little bit of a resistance, but God gave God gave Jehoiakim the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 2 of chapter 1 makes it clear that Nebuchadnezzar won because God willed it. This was punishment from God. And so we'll study a little bit more about this when we get into the actual when we get into the actual verse by verse. But I wanted us to see it was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in this first group of captives. Jehoiachin, Jehoiakim's son, reigns in Judah for 3 months until Nebuchadnezzar takes him and more of the vessels to Jerusalem. So in other words, it is not long before Jehoiachin reigns, or before Jehoiachin's taken out. Because Nebuchadnezzar is one of these guys that we're going to see in the book of Daniel is a temperamental guy. If you don't do what he says, there's going to be problems. And so next week then, we'll continue with the introduction. We'll take up with the last king of Judah. That would be Zedekiah. And what would happen with him before we get into discussing who Daniel is. And then we'll get into the book.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to